Well, hello, my friends. Welcome to me, your host, Christian Watson. So, everybody, we are now at part 2 in our post-liberalism series. If you have not seen part 0 and part 1 first, I would encourage you to go back and watch both of those videos before you continue with this one. In today's video, we're talking about what nationalism means for the post-liberal. Now, there are 3 concepts that I want all of you to understand so we can understand what a post-liberal might mean when they say that they are a nationalist, or what nationalist ideology might mean for them. I want you to understand A, the nation. What does a nation mean? B, what is a national state, or in other words, what is a government? And C, what is a national citizen? Essentially, what does it mean to be a citizen? All 3 of these concepts are interlocking and they all relate to each other, and at the very bottom of them, you will get what post-liberalism may mean by the term nationalism. Now, before we get into the technical side of understanding what this term might mean, we have to first use 2 very important post-liberal source documents to evaluate this term, or at least how the post-liberal treats the subject of the term. How does the post-liberal treat their fellow countrymen? How does the post-liberal see the citizen of a certain nation? And so there are 2 documents that help us understand this a little bit better. Those documents are Against the Dead Consensus, and the second one is the National Conservatism Statement of Principle. Now, as I mentioned before, National Conservatism is a brand name of post-liberalism. Not all post-liberals are national conservative, but all national conservatives are most certainly post-liberals. And similarly, Against the Dead Consensus was the first statement signed that is a sort of list of grievances for post-liberal thinkers. So, in Against the Dead Consensus, the signatories say the following in one of their sections: "We stand with the American citizen." They go on to say, "In recent years, some have argued for immigration, saying that working class Americans are less hardworking, less fertile, in some sense less worthy than potential immigrants. We oppose attempts to displace American citizens. Advancing the common good requires standing with rather than abandoning our countrymen. They are our fellow citizens. They are not interchangeable economic unions. And as Americans, we owe each other a distinct allegiance and must put each other first." So in this document, you see here that if you are an American, or generally if you're a citizen of any nation, you have this sort of obligation, this sort of bond to your countrymen. They are not simply people who you interact with on a transactional basis to get something out of. They are more special than that for the post-liberal. And you have to really ask yourself, what makes them so special? Well, we're going to get into this in a second, but the post-liberal goes ahead and they articulate more of what they mean when they say the citizen, your fellow countrymen, in the National Conservatism Statement. They have a section called God and Public Religion. And this section feeds into this notion of the common good, which I'll also do a separate video about. And in this section, they say the following: "No nation can endure without humility and gratitude before God, and fear of his judgment that are found in authentic religious tradition. For millennia, the Bible has been our surest guide, nourishing a fitting orientation toward God, to the political traditions of the nation, to public morals, to defense of the weak, and to the recognition of things rightly regarded as sacred. The Bible should be read as the first among the sources of shared Western civilization in schools and universities, and as the rightful inheritance of believers and non-believers alike." Listen to this: "Where a Christian majority exists, public life should be rooted in Christianity and its moral vision, which should be honored by the state and other institutions, both public and private. At the same time, they go on to say, Jews and other religious minorities are to be protected in the observance of their own traditions, in the free governance of their communal institutions, and in all matters pertaining to the rearing and education of their children. Adult individuals should be protected from religious or ideological coercion in their private lives and their homes. So for the post-liberal, we see this sort of separation, my friends, or rather this lack of separation between a citizen, the common good, and the public. And this is kind of where their idea of nationalism comes from. The classical liberal idea of the citizen or the individual is the sovereign individual who is the sort of basis of moral action, as in you cannot violate an individual's rights or their liberties without doing something immoral, and they are what the government is situated by. The idea of individual freedom is seen as the good in society. But what the post-liberal says is that this focus on the individual by himself, or even in the individual in a social context, but the individual getting a lot of emphasis in policy, in morality, is a problem because it does not acknowledge man's relationship with others in a manner that he cannot consent to, or in a manner that does not involve his own individual whim. And you see this sentiment really articulated in the work of Yoram Hazony, who essentially wrote the authoritative post-liberal account of nationalism in 2018 in his book called The Virtue of Nationalism. And he makes this point. He makes the point that the sort of classical liberal, John Locke-based focus on the individual is an impoverished account of man, and it is also not a very good basis for the legitimate rule of government. Now, Hazony starts with a few premises that are very important to understand. And we're going to use Hazony's ideas here as a sort of basis for the post-liberal idea of nationalism. Now, I will say this, there are factions and distinctions within the post-liberal American right. I'm not saying that everybody agrees with Hazony, but I am saying his ideas are popular and cemented enough amongst post-liberals that you can probably take his account of what a nation is, what a national state is, what a citizen is, as the authoritative post-liberal ingredients for their ideas of nationalism. I don't want to eschew nuance. I don't want to avoid nuance, but I think generally these ideas can be taken as the general sense of post-liberals. So in The Virtue of Nationalism, Hazony says the following about what a nation is. He defines a nation as a number of tribes with shared heritage, usually including a common language or religious traditions, and a past history of joining together against common enemies, characteristics that permit tribes so united to understand themselves as a community distinct from each other, such communities that are their neighbor. By a national state, okay, so we know what a nation is. They're a set of tribes with shared customs. A national state, he means a nation whose disparate tribes have come together under one single standing government, independent of all other governments. These definitions mean, he goes on to say, in the first place, that a nation is a form of community, a human collective recognizing itself as a distinct form, as distinct from other human collectives, Such a community can exist independently of the state and does not have to include every individual living within the state. Second, these definitions mean that the unity thus created is always composite because the tribes united in this way continue to exist after national independence. So for Yoram Hazony and for the post-liberals at large, a nation is these organizations that have shared customs, shared beliefs, shared value systems, and then the national state is essentially an extension of that. It is an extension of those tribes coming together under an alliance. Now, it's very important how Hazony phrases this, because he understands the nation as a collective. which is very different language than what Americans or people who are classical liberals would be comfortable using to describe political organization. Normally, we understand a nation, or at least a national state, as a result of the consent of the governed, things of that sort. That's the classical liberal view. But for Hazony, the nation, the national state, all of these concepts go beyond that single basis and have a more grander idea behind them, justifying them. And so Hazony goes on to explain more about the nation. He says, the nation is distinguished from the family or clan in that it is not a community of individuals who are known personally to one another. Okay, so for the post-liberal at large, a nation is not a community of people who you may know. It's not your mother, your father, or your extended family, but rather, no one, he says, no matter how much he may invest in the effort, can be personally acquainted with even a small fraction of the individuals who comprise a nation. The nation, he goes on to say, in other words, is not comprised of familiar individuals, but it is an impersonal abstraction, in the sense that humanity is an abstraction. For those of you who do not know what that word means, an abstraction is simply an idea that may not be very concrete. So you may have an idea of a steak that you want to eat one day, but that steak has not come into reality yet. You haven't made the steak quite yet. So for him, a nation are not these concrete relationships that you have with your friends or your brothers or sisters. No, a nation is this abstraction. But he goes on to contradict himself a little bit later after saying this. He says, yet at the same time, the nation is also distinguished from all of humanity in that it possesses a quite distinctive character, having its own language, laws, and religious traditions, its own past history of failure and achievement. This means, watch this, that each nation is different from all other nations, and that to the individual who is a member of a certain nation, it is known as a concrete and familiar being, much like a person, family, or clan. When the tribes of a nation unite to establish a national state, they bring to this state the familiar and distinctive character of its nation, its language, laws, and religious traditions. And the individual who shoulders the burdens imposed by the national state does so out of loyalty to the concrete and familiar nation which he is part. My friends, nationalism for the post-liberal has to do with adhering to this grand abstract idea of what a nation is, and then essentially being in obligation to service that grand abstract idea. Now, Hazony takes from this statement his understanding of individual freedom. An individual does not elect to be in a nation. He does not elect to be in a community. The individual is already in these things, and these things go beyond his ability to choose. So when they say we stand with the American citizen and against the dead consensus, what they're truly saying is, by virtue of you being American, you have an obligation to someone else who is also American, someone who you may have never met in your entire life, just because they're American, because there's a distinctive character to what it is to be American, and the individual, by virtue of being an American, has to adhere or uphold that. This is contrary to the classical liberal idea that governments are built on the consent of the governed, that all associations in society are meant to be voluntary and consensual. Hazony says explicitly that that idea is not how politics actually works. In fact, Hazony's objection to that idea is that actual political reality does not work that way, and that is a sort of utopian dreamland. And this is generally the sense held by post-liberals. He goes on to say this to further this point. When a philosopher seeks to found the state on the individual's freedom, calculations of personal benefit, and consent, he asks us to see the state as a large business enterprise. He takes an ideal type that has been developed to describe behavior in the marketplace and transfers it to the political sphere, supposing it will permit us to understand political behavior in the same way that it permitted us to understand economic behavior. But a free state is not a business enterprise. It is constituted and continues to exist in time, not because of business-like calculations of personal benefit and ongoing consent amongst its members, but only due to family-like bonds of mutual loyalty that persist among them. So the idea is you are not in any country allowed in a post-liberal viewpoint to have much of a say in the kind of government in that country, but rather you are a citizen of that country. There is an idea in that country higher than you that you must adhere to. And the same thing is true, according to Hazony, for family. Family is not a voluntary enterprise for Hazony. It is an obligation that you are born into and that you have to stick by no matter what. So you can understand why the post-liberals dislike divorce, why they dislike, people who treat family members in a manner that is transactional. They dislike all of these things. And another interesting thing, before we get on and we move on and we tie all this together, another interesting thing that Hazony says about this relationship between the individual, the collective, society, and the family, is he says, in relationship to the nation and everything, an individual's freedom is not their own. It belongs to the collective. He goes on to say, it is true that freedom describes an aspect of the actions and experience of the human individual. Just as interests and aspirations, triumph and tragedy, desire and fear and pain are features of the life and mental landscape of the individual. But these and similar terms are also used to describe human collectives. When a mother with a number of children is wounded in an accident or falls ill, for example, we say that the family is in pain. It is possible, if one exists, to imagine the mother, her husband, as distinct individuals, each experiencing his or her own personal pain. But this is not what members of a family experience in such circumstances. And he essentially goes on to say this very interesting statement. He says, just as a family can experience pain and triumph and tragedy, a family that plows with oxen can have a shared interest in purchasing a tractor. And so he goes on to say that a family is not, in other words, only a collection of individuals. It is an entity possessing certain properties that belong to it as a collective, as a whole. In taking part in the freedom of the collective, I experience something that is quite distinct from the strictly individual freedom of saying whatever I please or going wherever I want. It is tempting for this reason to say that individual freedom is one thing and collective freedom another, and that political freedoms consist in having some of both. But the reality is not so simple, because the individual is always bound by ties of mutual loyalty to his family, tribe, or nation. It is a mistake to suppose that he can have political freedom when the family, tribe, or nation are not free. That was a lot of stuff. To summarize, my friends, for the post-liberal, the idea of the nation is a form of organization or structure that predates you and I. It goes beyond you and I. Our own personal decisions, our desire to have consent in our personal and interpersonal and political relationships, all of that stuff is secondary to the obligations we have to further the nation, to further our family, and more broadly, to further the collective. Now, to understand the post-liberal nation state a little bit better, we have to really understand what Hazony thinks the basis of government is. Because if the basis of government is not the consent of the governed, it is not individual freedom, then what is it? Well, Hazony gives what he calls the first principle. And the first principle is what he calls the moral minimum required to have a government. And he goes all the way back to the sort of Protestant musings in history of what a good government is. He has a very traditionalist, a very religious idea of what that might be. And for Hazony, this idea mostly involves the fusion between what is called the public and what is called the private. The fusion between what happens in society and what happens in private. He says the following. He says, first, for the base of the government, the king or ruler, in order to rule by right, had to devote himself to the protection of his people in their family, life, and property, to justice in the courts, to the maintenance of the Sabbath, and to the public recognition of the one God. Roughly, the 10 precepts given at Sinai, which both Luther and Calvin regarded as a natural law. These precepts were seen as providing the minimum requirements for a life of personal freedom and dignity for all. A government incapable of maintaining this moral minimum was one that had failed in its most basic obligations to the well-being of the people. And the second thing which flows from this is the right for national self-determination, a right for a nation to determine what it wants to do and how it wants to conduct its own personal affairs. So for Hazony, the moral minimum for government is not consent. It is rather the government's ability to uphold certain institutions and ideas that advance more broadly the common good. He doesn't say the common good, but that's essentially what he means. So wrapping this up, what is nationalism for the post-liberal? Nationalism is an adherence to the collective, an adherence to the state, to the community, to the family, just generally the collective, in a manner consistent with the character of that collective. So, for example, if there is a Christian majority, an adherence to the Christian majority collective would involve practicing Christian rituals, holding Christian values, doing certain things, subordinating yourself to the precepts of that collective. That's what nationalism is. And it's based on this idea that, again, government and society is not based on consensual relationships between individuals. It's not based on a sort of idea of individual liberty. It's not based on anything except the advancement of the whole. And in believing this, the post-liberal therefore justifies their opinion towards the current state of society. They say, well, since this idea of loyalty and obligation have fallen by the wayside, whereas consent and individual free will have arisen, society has deteriorated because there's no more common purpose. And the only way to get common purpose in society for the post-liberal, for someone who is sympathetic to this idea, is to have these immutable bonds with one another. Again, this is not a video to debunk any of this. This is a video to explain. So we're going to recap again. What is nationalism for the post-liberal? Nationalism is adherence to the character and the sort of form of the state, the community, generally the collective. It's someone who adheres to the character and form of all of those things, one of those things, or what have you. And the nation and the nation state feed off of this idea. And the goal of the nation state is to advance the common good. And if you have a society in which individuals can choose what they would like, where consent runs rampant in their words, in their phrasing, then you don't have a society that can have a stable nation. You don't have a stable political order. You don't have anything but pure chaos. And so how do we revert all of this? By going back to the idea of the nation state, by adhering to the familial collective, by binding ourselves to tradition, and by putting our own self-interest to the wayside and rejecting the classical liberal vision that has been so popular since the eminence of John Locke. Now let's ask ourselves very quickly, how might these ideas of nation, family, and the role of the individual in society as a sort of servant of the collective as opposed to an initiator or independent from the collective, how do these ideas affect policy? Well, people like Hazony would say, since we have to preserve the distinctive character of the nation and the bonds that tie people in a nation together, our policies should further that. So policies, for example, that promote our countrymen, for example, promote the economic well-being of Americans, whether that be, in the opinion of the post-liberals, trade tariffs, which stop other countries from taking advantage of those workers, whether it be other kinds of restrictions that stop certain companies from moving between borders and disposing of American workers, whether that be a lack of interventionism and foreign conflicts, which may de-emphasize the nation's role to its citizens, things of that sort. Those kinds of policies would be welcomed amongst post-liberals because all of those policies preserve what they see as the fabric of the nation. Because if you have free trade, that means that the American worker is now competing on a global scale, which could mean, in the view of the post-liberals, that their own product and labor is disposable. It can be traded for cheaper labor. It can be traded for something else that might harm them. So a post-liberal may actually be upset over the demise of the coal industry, or may be upset over the outsourcing of jobs that is routine for many companies to economize, because again, these economic calculations don't take into account the mutual loyalties, bonds, and this sort of deep spiritual tie that everyone in a nation should have to one another, even if they don't know each other, even if they never met, even if there's no concrete relationship. Because again, the nation is both an abstraction and it is both concrete. That's the idea. So how would this manifest politically? In trade tariffs and blocking companies from being able to make certain economic decisions, and a reduced role in the world of foreign policy, things of that sort. So for all of you who are saying this is all highfalutin, no, these ideas manifest in policy, and depending on what you believe, the consequences of those policies can either be disastrous or good. I find the latter unlikely. This is the post-liberal idea of nationalism. This is heavy stuff, but my friends, we're going to keep studying. We're going to keep going forward. These are meant to be overviews, not comprehensive accounts. There are, of course, plenty of other concepts and questions that we have to ask ourselves. Okay, like, for example, what is the relationship between individual action and the preservation of the family, right? What is the common good? And we're going to address more of these questions in the context of post-liberalism as the series persists. But until next time, my friends, think on what I have said. And I love you guys so much, and please, forever and eternally, stay pensive. Bye, guys.